MLB Strategy Show sponsored by Jock Market. And we've got, a little more relevance to baseball DFS on the days where there's no football. So, there's definitely a lot of days we have downsized contests, mostly being Sundays, Mondays, Thursdays. But Wednesday, at least for today, we have a full-size slate. There's a decent amount of games here to look at. So, Adam, what do you overall make of today's slate?
10 gamer, normally pretty wide open, I think, as far as like not being that difficult to make tournament lineups that you actually like and are still relatively low owned. Like, for example, not having to play a bunch of Jake Arrieta like you did on the 4-gamer last night or 3-gamer last night. It's, to me, pretty fun just because like even the popular teams are typically, you're talking hitters being, 15, 20% owned. So bigger slate, I think, another one kind of like yesterday's main slate where you can just make some pretty good teams that are relatively low owned.
Yeah, and we can jump right in. The first game we have here on the slate, it is the Chicago Cubs playing in Philly against the Phillies. Ranger Suarez is going to be on the mound for Philadelphia. And first thing that kind of stands out about the Cubs from last night is I did not have very much exposure to Kyle Gibson last night. I was kind of in a panic about that through it was like 3 or 4 innings where he basically allowed nothing, was striking everybody out. And the Cubs kind of went nuts and got to him and were able to mute the production of Kyle Gibson. However, on the surface, still, we've got a pitcher here in Ranger Suarez that I generally don't think is nearly as good as Kyle Gibson, and kind of a similar sort of situation here. We have Ranger Suarez projected for 44.5% ownership. I do think it's a spot where, once again, against the Cubs, it's pretty good on paper, but relative to last night, I just don't think that Suarez warrants the ownership in the same way that Gibson didn't last night.
Yeah, I think it's a good spot as far as Suarez is relatively inexpensive at 7,200. The Cubs lead the league in strikeout percentage since the trade deadline, but they're not a bad offense overall. Since the trade deadline, their WRC plus is like 96 or 97, just shy of league average. They have about a 180 ISO. They just strike out a lot. So it's still a boom or bust spot where, I think there is a lot of upside for Suarez. He's been a pretty solid pitcher this season. As a starter, he has a 23.4% strikeout percentage, 3.79 xFIP. And I think he's a little bit underpriced here given the strikeout upside. But at the same time, like you said, he is pulling a ton of ownership, and it's not a terrible Cubs team in terms of production. So definitely I think he's a good play just, in terms of salary and projection, but definitely going to want to be paying attention to what else goes into those lineups ownership wise.
Yeah, and the other thing too, one thing that's kind of weird is I don't know if you ever look at the FanGraphs versus the Baseball Reference WAR numbers. There's something I was arguing with somebody on Twitter about the other day. They have like Wade Miley as the second most valuable pitcher in baseball over on Baseball Reference, and they have Ranger Suarez as the 10th overall most valuable pitcher, which I don't agree with any of that. But Ranger Suarez, at least the point here being, is he does have probably a little more pitcher quality than I gave him credit for off the bat. But still, I just don't think he's a pitcher who ever warrants being nearly 50% of lineups in the field. And then even over on FanDuel at 8,800, he's still fairly popular. It's 13% owned when he's 8,800, which is a pretty ridiculous kind of ownership to me at that price tag. But on the other side, just due to all the ownership getting to Suarez, are you going to be looking to get to the Cubs? Because yesterday, I stacked the Cubs solely because of the ownership on Kyle Gibson.
Yeah, I stacked the Cubs yesterday too. I didn't even plan on it. I didn't even really like the idea that much, but I ended up getting to them just because, I guess they were low owned and they did offer some negative correlation. But kind of the same boat here. They're not a team that I would really want tons of just because I think Suarez is pretty good. But at the same time, this park does play out power. You do have a weak Philly bullpen behind Suarez as well. So that's always something that, I'm not going to focus on it, but it does make it at least a little bit more likely that the Cubs find a way to have a good game. And like I had said before, they do have a lot of power in this lineup. They are inexpensive. Wilson Contreras is a relatively cheap catcher option. Frank Schwindel's still underpriced. Ian Happ has some power. It's not the worst lineup in terms of production. So not a team that I would expect to be my highest owned stack or anything like that. But right now we have them projected for about 2.5% aggregate ownership on DraftKings. They also actually have the highest top value percentage, which is something that tends to drive them up as well and would make sense too. Like if you're getting away from Suarez, you're getting away from that $7,200 pitcher. Maybe you decide to just kind of build your lineup completely differently and pay up for a couple of guys using those cheap Cubs bets would make sense in that way as well.
Yeah, and I like the leverage that's offered here. I like the price points. The only thing that's maybe a little bit of an issue that it might end up coming to if I'm just kind of looking ahead is there aren't that many pitchers that I'm dying to spend up for. So I guess a lot of my Cub stacks, it's going to have I guess Tyler McGill and Julio Urias as the pitchers. I don't really know who else I'd really be wanting to get to. Jose Urquidy to a smaller extent, I guess, at 10,000. So it's not like we're in desperate need to save salary on this slate, but at the very least, I think Cubs is one off. So that's another way to get some leverage here off of Ranger Suarez. Now, on the other side of the game, Alec Mills is going to be on the mound for the Chicago Cubs. And Alec Mills this year, another pitcher who he's going to fall just kind of in a category of pitchers to me who are priced under 7K today on DK, where it's like, okay, if they pop up in 1% to 2% of my lineups, I don't mind, but certainly not a priority. So to me, I think more of the focus becomes on the Philadelphia Phillies here, and how are you handling them as a stack?
Yeah, so I'm with you on Mills. Like maybe a little bit underpriced at 6,300 just in terms of his pitching talent. As a starter this year, he has a 4 flat xFIP. He's allowed 1 home run per 9, only a 17% strikeout percentage though. So certainly not someone I'm going out of my way to get to, especially against this Phillies team with a 5.5 implied run total. But the stack does look pretty good. It'll look better if JT Realmuto is able to rejoin the lineup. You know, yesterday we had Andrew Knapp in there, which gave you a $2,000 value bat that also takes one of the best Philadelphia bats out of the lineup. So if Realmuto is back, that lineup gets a little bit deeper. But you also have still favorable pricing on McCutchen at 3,600, Gregorius at 3,500, Miller at 3,400. That's in addition to the guys at the top of the order that have some power. So I do like Philadelphia. Right now we have them as 4th in the top stack tool, getting a little bit more ownership than they deserve in the aggregate, but trying to look individually to see if anyone in particular is pulling that up. And it's not anything crazy. You know, Bryce Harper's at 16%, Miller, Gregorius, Realmuto, all between 10 and 13%. So ownership, I think, is fine. I think the Phillies look like they're in a pretty good spot.
Yeah, and the other thing, too, about is where did this just close? All right, well, my tab just closed. I had a point I wanted to make about the ownership here, but apparently that's going to escape me here unless I could really quickly pull this data back up before the all right, no, never mind. All right, so the ownership, we're just going to go with everything you said because I'm going to have to restart my browser here. But I still do have my run sheet in front of me, so I do know the next game we've heard to talk about is the Baltimore Orioles at home against the New York Yankees. John Means against Nestor Cortez. I don't understand why there's no line for this game. There's no line. There's no total. At least there wasn't at the time that I put this together this morning, and I assume the Yankees are going to have a fairly healthy implied run total today. We do have them with the overall top stack odds on the slate. No surprising, we also have them projected to be the most popular team on the slate. So I feel like I'm going to be handling the Yankees kind of how I did yesterday. They're one of the overall top stacks on the team. They're worth getting exposure to, but I'm just not going to have quite as much as the field.
Yeah, Yankees minus 176, 9.5 total. So pretty heavy favorites, 5.5 to 6 implied run total. Orioles down around 4. I'm with you on the Yankees. I thought they were in a great spot yesterday. I think they're in a good spot today. John Means isn't the worst pitcher in the world, but he has struggled a bit since coming back from his injury. And more importantly, you know, again, not that it's the primary focus, but whenever Means leaves the game, you're just getting below average pitcher after below average pitcher coming in after him. We saw it, you know, in that Toronto series. We've seen it plenty of times this year where even if the Orioles starter pitches relatively well for, let's say, 5 innings, the opposing team still scores 10 plus runs because nobody in the bullpen can get an out. So still a very, very high upside spot for the Yankees. They're very affordable as well. Aaron Judge's salary and Stanton's salary dropped a bit from yesterday. LeMahieu's down to 4K. Luke Voigt's down to 3,600. I don't know what's happening with their DraftKings pricing, but they are very, very cheap. It's still a good spot. Overall this season against right-handed hitters, Means has a 20.2% strikeout percentage. He's allowed a 200 expected ISO. There's no reason for me not to like the Yankees here other than ownership that they're pulling. But again, on a 10-game slate, it's not that difficult to counteract some of this ownership. Aaron Judge, the highest projected owned guy on the Yankees at 24%. So it's not like you have anybody out here getting, you know, 35, 40% ownership. Yankees still look really good. Just sort of like I was saying about Ranger Suarez. I like them. Just pay attention to what else is in your lineup. You probably don't want to be running, you know, the 45% owned pitcher plus the Yankees plus every other most, you know, popular player you can find. Just make a pivot or two and you should be good with the Yankees.
Yeah, and on the other side, there was a split second when I was looking at the data this morning. I was considering John Means as a potential contrarian option, but his numbers are so poor in the second half of the season. He has a 5.06 FIP, a 4.98 xFIP. He's also seen a really strong dip in his strikeout rate. So first half of the season, John Means struck out 25.7% of the hitters he faced. Second half of the season, now down to 19.2%. We know about the injury he suffered earlier in the year, and I kind of think this is a thing where he overextended himself going for that no-hitter, and he's just never really quite bounced back from it. So to me, like I said, I briefly considered John Means as a leverage option. There aren't that many pitchers I like in this price range, but I don't think I'm ultimately going to get there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still like a reasonable play just because he's so inexpensive as well at 6,500. But it's definitely a play that you're not expecting to succeed all that often. It's more so just that it gives you a pitcher that not only is cheaper than Ranger Suarez and gets away from his ownership, but also, does negatively correlate with a lot of the field. Overall, Means probably about an average pitcher in the major league. So from a theory sense, I think it makes sense. From a practical standpoint and how much I actually end up getting to, I'd be surprised if I get much Means. But just from like an overall strategy standpoint, I think it makes sense to kind of just hope for the best and realize it's not going to work out all that often.
It's the hope for the best, expect the very, very worst, because this is a situation very easily you could envision him going into the negative fantasy point total. Now on the other side of the game, Nestor Cortes is going to be pitching for the Yankees, and he continues to find success. I don't really totally buy into it because he doesn't throw very hard. A lot of it's based on weird trickery and a stupid looking mustache, but 2.7 ERA, 3.12 expected ERA this year for Nestor Cortes. He's also a little more stretched out now than he was earlier in the year. He's striking guys out at a 25.8% rate. With Nestor Cortes, 7,900, and I actually think it's a little weird that he's not. We've seen him be so popular on so many slates lately, and even though I don't buy into it, I certainly prefer Nestor Cortes' 11.9% ownership than I do Ranger Suarez at 44.5%.
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, I like Suarez, but I don't think there should be a 4-to-1 gap between Suarez and Cortes here. To me, they're very, very similar. Strikeout as starters this year, Suarez with a 23.4% strikeout percentage. Cortes is at 22.2. 4.83 xFIP for Cortes is like a full run worse than Suarez, and he's given up some home runs. But I still kind of just view it as pitchers that we don't really know what they're going to look like as starters long term. They've had some semblance of success so far. Suarez a bit more than Cortes, but still, similar strikeout rates, similar matchups. I think like the Cubs strike out a lot, but also have power and are around an average offense. The Orioles are a bit better offense, don't strike out quite as much, but there's still strikeouts here. It's just one of those situations where, I think everything looks a little bit better for Suarez, but I don't think it looks, 400% better like ownership is suggesting that it does. So I think that Cortes is just a good tournament option at 7,900, I think.
Yeah, and I would be surprised if his ownership doesn't come up throughout the day. And also, all the more reason, guys, like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're going to have more information later on the day when it comes to the deeper dive and live before lock for the baseball slate. But Cortes has been so popular so many slates in a row. I find it odd that all of a sudden he would just not be a popular option. Honestly, where there's fairly limited pitching and he is a positive matchup against the Orioles. Obviously a little bit of speculation here, but would you also assume that ownership goes up throughout the day?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if you saw something where it ends up, 28, 30% Suarez, 20, 22% Cortes or something like that. Yeah,
so at least as of now, given the data, Cortes is actually probably my favorite GPP pitcher on the entire slate. We only have him for 11.9% ownership. We have him with the third best top pitcher odds on the slate. And then over on FanDuel, where he is priced at 7,700, and we're only projecting him for 4% ownership. That's another spot that I think that it makes sense to get overweight to the field on Nestor Cortes. Maybe the only thing that I'll add to this about Cortes is what kind of length you expecting we're going to be able to get out of him?
He should be fine. He's thrown over 100 pitches in 2 of his last 4 starts. He's fully good to go at this point. 6 innings last start, 103 pitches against Toronto, 5 2/3, 5 1/3, 7-6 innings pitched over his last 5 starts. So I don't have any concerns about how deep he can go into this game.
Yeah, it was definitely something that was an issue for a little bit, but at least it's been about a month since we've really seen pitch count be an issue. He's gotten at least 5 starts in every single outing since July 23rd. So it was definitely something where at first with Nestor Cortes as a starter, it's like how many innings are going to go. That does seem to be a little bit less of an issue. But on the other side with the Baltimore Orioles, it is an offense that we have seen with a little bit of power upside. But we have him about appropriately owned. Nestor Cortes looks under-owned to me. So the Orioles are not going to be appealing stack to me unless we see some sort of crazy boost in Cortes' ownership.
Yeah, if Cortes' ownership comes up, the Orioles certainly start to look more appealing. As is, I still think that there are some reasonable spots. Austin Hayes at 3,200. If Mancini's in the lineup at 3,700, Santander would look good at 3,500. But they're a little bit more difficult to stack now because we suddenly have Ryan Mountcastle at $5,000. Mullins is still at 4,700. So this used to be a team where it was basically Mullins was expensive and everyone else was free. Now you have still some pretty cheap bats, but you have another guy in Mountcastle that you would really like to get if you're stacking the Orioles. That's really expensive. So it's going to make it a little bit more difficult to get there. They do have power, but again, 10-game slate, it's not likely to be a priority for me.
Yeah, that is where I'm at as well. Next game that we have here to talk about, and we have a pitcher here that I think is going to kind of be hard to not be somewhat of a priority. That is Tyler McGill on the mound for the New York Mets. And just relative to the other pitching options on the slate, it's very slim pickings. We've got Julio Urias at the combined two pitchers, Julio Urias and Ranger Suarez. We've got Julio Urias at the top of the pricing range, Ranger Suarez being the chalk at the bottom. And then, we look at the guys in between, and there aren't that many guys to really like that stand out on this slate. One of them for me kind of becomes McGill, number one. He's had a successful rookie year. Number two, also, I think this should be a favorable matchup for him against the Cardinals that have a very right-hand dominant lineup.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good matchup in terms of run prevention. I don't really like it in terms of strikeouts. The Cardinals just haven't struck out a lot this year. But like you were saying, there's no real slam dunk pitchers on this slate. McGill is having a good year overall against right-handed hitters, a 30.3% strikeout percentage, 103 expected ISO, 233 expected WOBA. But he's been very, very good against same-handed hitters, and that's pretty much all the Cardinals have in their lineup, with the exception of Carlson and Edmund and John Lester, if you want to count him. But so I think it sets up as a good spot overall for McGill. Only a 3.8 implied run total. Salary's reasonable at 9,200. There's not really much negative for me to say about McGill. I think he looks like one of the better pitching options today.
Yeah, and it's also a thing we're talking about. If you're using the Cubs as a leverage stack, say today, it's just where else are you going to pay up for pitching? I think Julio Urias is one of the obvious options. But obviously, if you're rostering the Cubs, then that means Ranger Suarez is in that lineup, and it's a cheap offense. You probably have to pay up for somebody. And then you're looking at Uskar, is a good option. We'll talk about him later. McGill, Shomanai is a little bit overpriced. Joe Musgrove, I hate that matchup for him. Jose Urquidy, there's a lack of upside. So a lot of these guys look very similar to me at the top end. And McGill just kind of by default, I think he makes it in. I agree with you that there's not the most strikeout upside in the world. But even with that said, I don't know there's that much upside in the other pitchers we're comparing him to, especially if somebody like Jose Urquidy is 10,000. But on the other side of the game, are you going to be looking to stack the Cardinals at all against McGill?
I doubt it. Just not really a spot I want to target. You can certainly make the negative correlation argument for the Cardinals, but a lot of right-handed bats. And like I had said, McGill's just been absolutely lights out against right-handed hitters this year. The pricing is fine, but I guess Dylan Carlson at 2,900, if I had to go to anybody, would be the first spot I look to. McGill has allowed a 256 expected ISO to lefties, 340 expected WOBA. He's had some issues in that platoon split. So Dylan Carlson at 2,900, I think is a pretty good value, but overall, not really interested in the Cardinals.
Yeah, and then starting for the Cardinals is going to be John Lester, and maybe a slight disagreement with me on our top stack odds right now. We have the Mets actually kind of towards the middle of the slate, middle/bottom. We only have with a 3.9% chance to be the top scoring team of the day. And John Lester's been so miserable this year: 4.75 ERA, 5.19 expected ERA, 5.42 FIP. His fastball velocity is dipped to 89.1 miles per hour on average. He doesn't generate strikeouts anymore. His walk rate is way up. I just don't think John Lester has anything left in the tank. And kind of despite what our top stack odds say, I think this is a pretty high upside spot for the Mets.
I think so too. Against righties this year, 180 expected ISO is a bit lower than his 205 actual ISO allowed. 353 expected WOBA compared to a 376 actual WOBA. So maybe getting a little bit unlucky, but at the same time, if you tell me that the pitcher has a 353, WOBA and 180 ISO allowed, I'm still going to want to take right-handed bats against him, especially when he only has a 13.2% strikeout percentage. Also, on top of that, there is speed in this Mets lineup. Lester has gone back to not really controlling the running game that well. He's allowed 11 stolen bases this year, grades out as below average at preventing stolen bases for the first time in, I think, in a couple of years. First time since 2016. He had kind of gotten under control for a while, but now seems to be back to not doing a very good job of controlling it. So guys like VR, Javi Baez, if they get on base, there is additional upside there as well, in addition to the power upside that you get against Lester.
Yeah, and there's not a single hitter in this lineup that's overly popular. The highest owned player right now, we've got Pete Alonso at 9.1%. Other than that, or actually VR at 9.7%, but everybody's sub 10%. Francisco Lindor, after a really poor start to the year, he's back. He's playing at a high level again. So we've got him at 3.9% ownership. That seems too low for me in a matchup against John Lester. So top to bottom, I think there are a lot of players to like here in this Mets lineup. John Lester has not really appeared to have anything going for him this year, at least certainly not in terms of fantasy upside, in addition to not preventing runs. He's not striking anybody out. So I don't think there's any reason to consider him. And then the Mets, pretty much everybody, I think, is in a pretty good spot in the Mets lineup. So to me, this is going to be a fairly high priority stack. And I'm hoping that the numbers will agree with me throughout the day and the top stack odds will come up because it's a team I'm going to be getting to kind of regardless. Next game here to talk about, and this is another pitcher who I'm kind of, given the context of the slate, I'm surprised Yuscar Ynoa is not more popular because he's at home. He's facing a Colorado Rockies team that's bad against right-handed pitching. They're bad on the road. Ynoa has considerable strikeout upside. What are we missing here that isn't making him become more popular today?
Not really sure. 27.4% strikeout percentage, very good matchup against the Rockies. 3.6 implied run total, so it's not like the Vegas line should be scaring people off. I think overall it just looks like a really good spot. This Rockies team is garbage outside of Coors Field. Ynoa has had success for the most part this year. 3.4 xFIP as a starter. Mentioned the 27.5% strikeout percentage. 1.26 home runs per nine is a bit elevated, but I think it's a good matchup. I think the price tag's fine at 8,900. I don't really see any reason why I wouldn't be rostering quite a bit of Ynoa here.
Yeah, so for me, I look at some of these pitchers on the high end today, and I think for tournaments, Ynoa is actually my favorite. Between Julio Suarez, Tyler McGill, Yuscar Ynoa, Sean Manaea, Joe Musgrove. What's that?
Julio Suarez again.
Oh, I don't know why I could. Julio Urias. Ynoa, Sean Manaea, Joe Musgrove, Jose Urquidy. Of all those guys, Ynoa, I think, has the most upside, and he's only 20% owned. That's fairly reasonable. The Rockies are a team that we've been picking on with right-hand pitching or picking on the Rockies on the road all year. So I really like Ynoa. I think the price tag may be a little steep at 8,900, but I mean, still relative to these other options, so I don't think all that much upside. I really like the spot for Ynoa, and he's going to be a very high priority play for me. Is that reasonable to say, or is there somebody else on the high end that you prefer to Ynoa?
No, I agree with that. Like you were saying, the price tag isn't great in the sense of he does actually have to go have, a good game to make you really happy. You rostered him at 8,900. There's not a whole lot of margin for error, but there's not really anyone in this price range that I feel stronger about. I like McGill a lot as well, but the same thing about the price that, the same price issue with Ynoa applies to McGill as well. Not really much wiggle room for him there against the Cardinals. Urias is really expensive. So yeah, there's Manaea is expensive. Musgrove's got a tough matchup. There's nothing really at this price range that I look at and I'm just like, oh, I'm really confident they pay off this salary. And I think that in terms of ceiling and strikeout potential and matchup, Ynoa is as good as anyone's.
Yeah, and there is a slight amount of rain concern here, although I don't think that's what's really driving the ownership at this point in the day. But right now we're looking at about 25 to 30% chance of rain, but also looks like there's going to be a clearing where even if it rains at the start of the game, they could just delay and end up playing later. So it's not something that, at least as of now, is a massive concern for me. And certainly wouldn't warrant, only being 20% owned over on DK. But other side, then with the Colorado Rockies, they are a team who, when they're on the road, I don't really like to roster them. When they're against right-handed pitching, I don't really like to roster them. So the Colorado Rockies today look like one of the weaker stacks on the slate.
I don't even really like rostering them when they're at home either, but
that as well.
Certainly, getting them here outside of Coors against Ynoa, I think one of the weaker spots on the slate.
Yeah, and then on the other side, we're going to have Antonio Senzatella starting for the Colorado Rockies. And, Senzatella, he isn't good, but I think maybe he's not quite as bad as it might appear to be, just being that he's a guy who has to make a lot of his starts at Coors Field. He's not a player who typically offers much fantasy upside because of his lack of strikeout stuff. And he's certainly not going to present upside today on DraftKings when he's priced at 7,700 on the road in Atlanta. That's a bit of an odd price tag. Over on FanDuel, he's priced at 9,000. So whatever it is about the pricing algorithms, they're looking at Antonio Senzatella and deciding that he should be a premium today on both sites, which he most certainly should not. But on the other side, how often do you think you might be looking to get to the Braves in a fairly decent spot against Senzatella?
The way things look right now, I think I get to Atlanta a lot. I agree with you completely. Senzatella, nowhere near as bad a pitcher, I think, as people assume that he is, because he's a terrible DFS pitcher, only a 15.9% strikeout percentage. But for the season, only about a 5% walk percentage, 4.16 xFIP, 0.72 home runs per nine. He's allowed a 171 expected ISO and 330 expected WOBA to righties. Those, I mean, it's not great, but it's certainly not bad. 310 expected WOBA, 110 expected ISO to lefties. He really is not bad at limiting production, but the Braves are getting virtually no ownership here. They're facing a pitcher that's going to let them put the ball in play. They still have a 5 implied run total. And this is just a lineup full of guys that if they're going to put the ball in play, they typically are able to do damage. You have so much power in this lineup, really top to bottom from Albies through Peterson. If we get the lineup that we're expecting here, the pricing is, I think, overall reasonable. Like, you have a very expensive Freddie Freeman. Albies is $5,100. Riley's $5,400. But you also can offset that a bit with a $4,300 Soler, a 4K Darno. Peterson's only $3,400. So in terms of a full stack, it ends up not being that expensive depending on how you do it. I think as long as they're not pulling much ownership, I like Atlanta a lot because of the ceiling that they have. If they do become popular as the day goes on, I would change my tune because, like, I don't think it's a horrible matchup I don't think it's a great matchup rather. Against Senzatella, but he's certainly a pitcher that I'm not going to shy away from stacking a team as loaded as the Braves at low ownership.
Yeah, and Senzatella could be a pitcher who's a little difficult to generate upside against, just given the amount of ground balls he generates. But with that said, it's only 2.6% ownership going to one of the best offenses in baseball. And like you said, also, there is some favorable pricing here once we get past some of the studs in the lineup. You're also Jorge Soler, who we know he has power upside at 4,300. Adam Duvall, he has power upside. He's at 4,700. And these guys are both projected for 2% ownership. So I just think those are numbers that are incorrect. We do have Atlanta as the second most positively leveraged stack team today. Only the Oakland A's are higher than them in our top stacks tool. So to me, we look at some of the upper tier offenses, and if we're looking to get underweight to the field on the Yankees, I think the Braves are one of the most sensible teams to get overweight to today.
Yep, completely agree, because they give you that same ceiling that the Yankees do. Yeah, they're less likely to come through against Senzatella than the Yankees are against Means and the Orioles bullpen, but they still they're very similar in that they just have power top to bottom in that lineup.
All right, next game here to talk about, it is going to be the Minnesota Twins at home against the Cleveland Indians. And let's start with Griffin Jax, who's going to be on the mound for Minnesota, who very, very unimpressive looking numbers and definitely struggles to generate swing and misses. So the spot for Cleveland does appear to be pretty good on paper, but the ownership's kind of already there. 6.2% projected ownership compared to a 6.8% top stack odds. The Indians are a team that I certainly think are worth getting to, but just not that much different in the field. They're somewhat popular already.
Yeah, I think it's a good spot overall. Jax, nothing really about him suggested he was going to be good in the major leagues, and so far he hasn't. Only about an 18% strikeout percentage, 5.62 xFIP, 2.26 home runs per 9 innings allowed. As far as his splits go, he's actually held righties to a .096. That's Cal Quantrill, never mind. He's not held righties to anything. He's allowed a 270 expected ISO, 239 expected ISO to left-handed hitters. So he's giving it up to both sides of the plate. And the Indians, it might not be the strongest lineup, but you still have Jose Ramirez, you have Franmil Reyes, who both have tons of power. Bobby Bradley's got power. The bottom of the order is really, really cheap in a good spot. So, like, the only guys that I really love here are Ramirez and Reyes, but I'm certainly not going to be upset about getting the full Indian stacks against a pitcher who I think is just pretty terrible.
Yeah, and at least with some of those other guys, when we get to them, they're also pretty inexpensive, especially towards the bottom of the lineup, where Howard Ramirez, Bradley Zimmer, they're both $2,700. If you need a cheap catcher to roster, Roberto Perez, $2,300. Jimenez is $3,200. So there's certainly a lot of salary savings we had down the order. Bobby Bradley at $4,200. He's another one that I would consider to be a viable option. So like you said, the two priorities would definitely be Jose Ramirez and Franmil Reyes. But there's a little bit of ownership going there to Ramirez, and those guys at the bottom of the order, not so much. And I think the price tags are reasonable. So Griffin Jax, I don't think is any good. So it's a stack which, once again, I think is one to be about even with the field on somewhere in that like 6 to 7% range. But then let's talk about Cal Quantrill a little bit as a starter, because he's done a pretty good job of limiting runs this year, although it's definitely been luck-based. 271 BABIP, 80.5% strand rate, so 3.04 ERA, but a 4.05 expected ERA. Overall, still an okay pitcher for the year, but just not quite as good as what the run prevention numbers suggest. But then we also have with Cal Quantrill today, 8,700 price tag. That's pretty inflated. So I'm kind of looking at it this way. I don't think there's enough upside to roster Cal Quantrill. But on the other side, I kind of think he's good enough that I'm not really dying to roster the Twins either.
I think I'm a little more interested in Quantrill in tournaments just because right now he's projected for like 1% ownership. And he's also at a price point where there's not a whole lot around him on DraftKings. You have Ynoa that's $500 more expensive. But other than that, there's just not a whole lot in that price range. So I could see just getting to some lineups where it's like, oh, well, I can't quite afford Ynoa. Quantrill is good enough. His strikeout numbers have been up recently as well. Not that you want to read too much into that, but 23.2% strikeout percentage over his last 10 starts compared to 20% for the season overall. Pretty average numbers overall, like you had said, 4.39 xFIP, 1.06 home runs per nine. Has done a very good job limiting right-handed power, 0.096 expected ISO, 315 expected WOBA. Lefties have a 186 expected ISO, 299 expected WOBA. I think he's just a decent pitcher where, he's a little bit overpriced, but again, he's just not getting ownership and he's kind of at a price point that there's not a whole lot of options really at that same level. They're all either, like $500 less or $500 more. There are also strikeouts in the Minnesota lineup, even though it's a dangerous lineup overall in terms of power. So certainly not planning to take any sort of crazy stand on Quantrill, but I do think at 1% ownership, it's a guy where he probably deserves a little bit more than that.
Yeah, we do have him with a 6.9% chance to be a top 2 scoring pitcher on the slate. So at the very least, he's a guy who doesn't have, a 0% chance of being a top scoring pitcher on the slate, but his ownership is close to 0. So from that standpoint, I think it's reasonable. I just don't know he's ultimately going to end up making my player pool because I still somewhat like some of these guys in the price range. I don't love any of them, but somebody like Uskar, we talk about him. I think there's some reason to think there's upside. Joe Musgrove, my least favorite pitcher in all of baseball, but it's hard to deny that there is some strikeout upside there. So I don't think that Cal Quantrill is going to end up making the player pool for me, but who knows? Maybe if he ends up remaining sub 1% through lock, I'll change my tune a little bit. And kind of another guy who I'm going to feel somewhat similar with in the next game we have here. It is Jose Urquidy on the mound for the Houston Astros against the Texas Rangers. And good matchup on paper for Urquidy. It's just 10,000 is a really steep price tag to pay for a guy like him over on DK. On FanDuel, he's 8,700, and I guess he's safe because it's the Texas Rangers and Urquidy isn't terrible as a pitcher, but I just don't really understand the salary.
Me neither. I think he's a pretty decent pitcher. I think the matchup is good. I just don't understand the salary. I mean, he's made 2 starts since June. September 3rd, September 8th, 71 pitches in 4 1/3 against the Padres, 70 pitches in 3 innings against the Mariners, gave up 2 earned runs in both of those starts. So it doesn't seem like it was a situation where, I could be wrong. I'm not looking at the game logs, but it doesn't seem like it was a situation where they were looking to have him go deeper and he got pulled really, especially the last one where he was pulled after 3 innings. So He threw 100 pitches earlier in the year on June 11th, but that was a few months ago. I don't really see anything that suggests that the game plan for Houston is going to be like have Urquidy go 6-7 innings, throw 105 pitches or something like that, like you kind of would like him to at $10,000. So the matchup's good. If he goes 5 innings, he certainly can give you a decent start, but I have a really hard time getting to the salary.
Yeah, that's also, I always have a little bit of a sour taste in my mouth for that Urquidy this year because it was my worst betting loss of the season this year. He was pitching was it against the Angels? I can't remember. Yeah, it was against the Angels. So he's pitching against the Angels. The start was May 12th. He had a strikeout prop of over under 4.5. And that was the first game that Mike Trout dealt with the calf injury, didn't end up playing. So Trout was expected to be in the lineup. Trout ends up not playing, not playing for basically the rest of the season after that. And it was Urquidy was over under 4.5 strikeouts. He ends up pitching 3 2/3 innings. And it was like over 4.5 was like plus 180 or something like that. And it was the biggest baseball bet I've made of a season. He pitches 3 2/3 innings, strikes out 4 batters, and then gets hurt warming up and doesn't come back into the game. It was a lot. And then I think the reliever came in after him, ended up striking out the side. But that's the most strikeout upside I've seen from Urquidy all year was that one game. And then he's been hurt since then. Limited pitches also been times we haven't really seen all that much strikeout upside from him. In his last handful of starts, he pitched 3 innings against Seattle, struck out 2. Time against the Padres, 4 1/3 innings, struck out 4. So I don't know how deep he's going to go into the game. I don't think he's that much strikeout upside when he's in there. So it's somebody Urquidy. I think I'm just going to have to stay away at that salary. But on the other side, the Texas Rangers, they're picking up no ownership, but I think it's warranted. There's good reason not picking up ownership.
Yeah, agreed. I don't think Urquidy's a bad pitcher. I do think Texas is a bad offense. Urquidy's not getting ownership, so it's not like going to a low probability offense like Texas is giving you negative correlation with the field. You're basically just in a situation where you're saying, oh, I think Texas is going to outscore 19 other teams today and win me a tournament, just basically carrying me on their backs. And that's not likely to ever happen.
Yeah, and by the way, talking about teams that have not carried us at all recently, the Houston Astros offense, who are once again in a good spot on paper against Kohei Arihara, but the Houston Astros yesterday had the overall highest top stack odds. They did not come through whatsoever. They totally dudded yesterday. Not the first time that I've liked the Houston Astros over the last couple months, and they put up a dud. Surely this has to be a spot where they put some runs up on the board. Arihara this year, 5.89 ERA, 7.63 expected ERA. He is not striking guys out. He's walking hitters. He's given up a lot of home runs. How do the Astros fail in this spot once again?
I'm sure they will, because I've been in the same boat with you. It seems like them in Toronto, if I don't play them, they score 100. If I do, then they score like 1. But just going right back to them, I mean, Arihara hasn't been good at all this season, like you said. Not like it's a huge sample, but against righties, a 370 expected ISO, 438 expected WOBA, 358 expected WOBA, 204 expected ISO to lefties. Not good strikeout numbers. 5.5 implied run total for Houston. They're getting some ownership as a whole, but it's just not anything crazy. Bregman and Yordan Alvarez lead the way at 21 to 22%. Those numbers are low enough where you can still find some ways to balance it out and get an overall low-owned team pretty easily. I think it's a really, really good spot for Houston. Going right back to them, fully expecting to just be lighting money on fire again, but don't really see any way around it.
Yeah, this is it's almost power. Like, if we keep playing Houston and they're in good spot, it's going to come through eventually. And they're still, it's crazy that if you look at them, even in the second half of the season, because somebody had said, well, I think somebody brought up the point, I can't remember what it was in YouTube chat, that said, sure, Houston was good in the first half of the season, but they've just been bad in the second half of the season. And that kind of feels like it's the case. But then went and sorted their WRC plus by first and second half of the season. And post All-Star break, they still look the third best WRC plus in baseball. So it's not they've been bad. It just hasn't worked out for fantasy on a lot of nights that you and I have been on them. It hasn't worked on a lot of nights that we've called them a strong stack. But once again, I think that in terms of a 5-man stack, maybe they're a little bit too popular today, but a lot of individual hitters I'm going to have to get to today. I'm going to have to plug in these guys as one-offs. You mentioned Alvarez, mentioned Bregman. It is a really good spot for them against a pitcher who probably doesn't belong in the MLB.
Yeah, and even if they had been bad in the second half, anytime you have a lineup that the top 6 are Altuve, Bregman, Correa, Alvarez, Gurriel, Tucker, it doesn't really matter what the results have been for the last month and a half or 2 months. It's not going to be a bad offense.
Yeah, and once again, Bregman 4,400. That's an incorrect price tag for him. He should be significantly more expensive than that. And then Yordan Alvarez, even at 5,000, I don't know that there should be any slates where Yordan Alvarez isn't around 6K at this point. He has proven himself to be one of the best overall power hitters in baseball. So especially in a plus matchup, 5,000, you wouldn't think of it as a value price for an outfielder in baseball, but for this particular slate, it actually might be. Next game we've here to talk about, it is Sean Manaea on the mound for the Oakland A's going up against the Kansas City Royals. Now, Sean Manaea for this spot, I think we have to kind of consider him, or compare him to all the other guys that are in the same kind of price range. So relative to guys like Jose Urquidy, I like him more than Urquidy, Joe Musgrove, Ynoa, Julio Urias. I didn't say Julio Suarez at the time. I said Julio Urias. I think that Sean Manaea is probably one of the weaker options just from a projection basis. But here's what gravitates me towards him. He's only projected for 9.5% ownership, and that's just not enough of a number on this particular slate where the pitching options aren't that strong. So 9.5% projected ownership for Manaea compared to a 17.3% chance of being a top pitcher. I think he's a really strong contrarian pay-up option.
I view him really similarly to how I viewed Jose Barrios and Frankie Montas yesterday. Obviously, Montas disappointed miserably, but still, it's just like if I'm just ignoring ownership completely, like if I have a low owned stack, I would rather get to Huascar Ynoa. I'd rather get to Tyler McGill. I'd rather get to Urias, at a little bit higher salary. But because I like the Yankees, because I like the Astros, I don't really want to just not be playing hitters from those teams. There's going to be some lineups where I need to save ownership somewhere. And I do think that even though Manaea is a bit weaker option in terms of projection than those guys, he still certainly has the ability to go out there and dominate this Kansas City team. He's still a good pitcher overall, comes in with a 26.6% strikeout percentage. To compare that to these other guys, Urias is at 26.7%. McGill's at 27.2. Ynoa's at 27.4. So he's within a point of all these other, more popular pitchers. He has a 3.54 xFIP, which is better than Urias and McGill, not quite as good as Ynoa. He's a good pitcher overall. It's a relatively tough strikeout matchup, but the drop off in ownership when you're getting him at about 10%, basically 1/3 the ownership of McGill, basically, 35% the ownership of Urias, 40% the ownership of Urias, half the ownership of Ynoa. He's going to be useful in tournaments, I think, where you do have more popular stacks.
Yeah, and on the other side, the Kansas City Royals, and by the way, Eric Lindquist last night won a tournament stacking the Kansas City Royals against Frankie Montas. So number one, congrats to him on that. Number two, doesn't mean I'm going to want to stack them today against Sean Manaea. Kansas City Royals, we do have them being a very low probability stack, 1.9% projected odds to be a top scoring team on the slate, 1% projected ownership. There's other offenses that are under-owned that I'd rather get to. The Royals, they just look like a team that's probably not going to make the cut for me.
Yeah, agreed. Although, they weren't for me yesterday either, and apparently won Eric a tournament. So, but yeah, it's not a spot that I really see getting to.
Yeah, and by the way, Eric's actually watching the show right now in the chat. And by the way, also Eric, I think I deserve like 50% of the credit for him winning the tournament, because if you've ever done a show with Eric before, we're like 5 minutes to go into lock. He's like, none of my lineups are updated, so it's like, all right, I'm going to talk for the next 5 minutes. You update your lineups, and apparently it was worthwhile because he ended up winning a tournament out of it, or else it would have been that same situation we've seen other times where Eric is just playing dead lineups. So yesterday, Eric, you owe me I don't know, a hand job or something, at least at the very bare minimum. I get there's got to be a little bit of kickback here, but congrats to Eric for winning the tournament last night. And on the other side of the game, Mike Minor is going to be pitching for the Kansas City Royals against the Oakland A's. And I think Mike Minor is fine as a pitcher, but as for Oakland as an offense, there's no ownership going here. So the two most positively leveraged offenses we have today, number one overall is Oakland. We talked about the Braves, them being number two. These are the two contrarian teams that I really think make sense. 1.1% projected ownership for Oakland. It's just way too low. Agreed.
It seems like this team just never pulls that much ownership. And there's a lot of slates where it's like, oh, I like Oakland. I think they're too low owned. And then once I build lineups and play them, it's like, oh, I still barely got to Oakland. But I think that it's a good spot again. You're getting them outside of Oakland going into Kansas City. Mike Minor, I think, is basically a league average pitcher. He's not someone that I'm like actively looking to take bets against, but when you get an offense with as much upside as the A's have at low ownership, I'm not going to shy away against Minor either. So I do like Oakland quite a bit. They look like they're going pretty under-owned here.
Yeah, and also it was kind of a similar situation yesterday. Oakland ended up being my most rostered offense, and if the slate started right now, I assume Oakland would once again be my most rostered offense in the spot against Mike Minor, just where we get a Parker upgrade for Oakland going into Kansas City, and no ownership here. The only players picking up any sort of ownership, Yan Gomes, 3.3%. Every single other player in the lineup, 1% or lower. We've got Matt Olson projected for 0.5% ownership, Matt Chapman, 0.9%, Mark Hanna, 0.5%. There's just no ownership going here to a pretty good offense. It's in a situation against Mike Minor, who, once again, Minor doesn't suck or anything, except he's not some sort of lights out pitcher that I'd be looking at him and being like, oh, I have to avoid one of the best offenses in baseball going up against Mike Minor. Mike Minor is a 5.05 ERA this year, 4.44 expected ERA. So relative to other offense on the slate, how high of a priority is Oakland for you?
I think they're up there. But like as far as contrarian offenses go, I think I'd still get to Atlanta before I get to Oakland. Not by wide margin, just like them a little bit better. Still obviously really like Houston, really like the Yankees. So I wouldn't be shocked if this is another slate where it's just like, man, I didn't get quite as much Oakland as I would like. But at the same time, when I'm just looking at, low-owned offenses, I would say other than Atlanta, they're my favorite.
Yeah, so totally on the same page with you there. And moving on, the next game to talk about, these are going to be pitchers that I assume we don't have interest in. Dallas Keuchel on the mound for the Chicago White Sox. Jansen Junk is going to be starting for the, by the way, terrific pitcher named Jansen Junk, which I assume that I'm pronouncing that correctly, on the mound for the Angels today. But Junk, we've only seen him pitch 3 2/3 big league innings this year, so there's not really too much data we could pull from that. Other than that, he was in the minor league system for both the Yankees and the Angels this year. With the Yankees this year, Junk had pretty good minor league numbers, 1.78 ERA, 3.58 FIP. Double A for the Angels, though, 5.27 ERA, 4.42 FIP. He is 25 years old. He's an unranked prospect. Zips has him projected with a 7.03 ERA this year, which I think is the worst ERA I've ever seen Zips project somebody for the rest of the season. So Jansen Junk, safe to assume this guy is probably going to suck.
Yeah, seems that way. Like you said, the strikeout numbers at AA for both the Yankees and the Angels have been solid this year, but the jump from AA to the majors is a pretty big one. He's also almost 26 years old, so it's not like this is a guy playing at the appropriate level for his age. As he's striking guys out at AA, it's kind of like, being a senior in high school and striking out the JV team. So I don't expect him to be very good here. He does have a limited time at AAA with the Yankees in 2019, but he only threw 2 1/3 innings. So basically this guy is just jumping straight into the majors from A ball and AA. No real reason to think that he's going to be good, I don't think. Pretty tough spot here against the White Sox, 5.8 implied run total. I don't anticipate Jump being any good.
Yeah, I think the only thing that kind of becomes complicated then is on the other side. Once again, we're going to have a very popular Chicago White Sox stack, and kind of in a similar situation with the Astros. They're picking up a lot of ownership. I understand why. At least here's the one good thing we'd say about the White Sox, and with them being popular, we could reduce the ownership share pretty significantly by playing some guys at the end of the lineup, which is a route that I think I'm going to be going down and looking at the context of this slate. Cesar Hernandez project for 6.7% ownership, Leury Garcia 3.7%, Gavin Sheets 7.4%. Sure, the guys at the top of the order are really popular, and Robert, Abreu, Jimenez, but mixing and matching them with some of these lower end of the order guys, I think still creates you a lineup that's somewhat unique.
Yeah, that was something that actually I had noticed yesterday. I was looking at one point during the slate, looking at through some of the lineups at the top of the big $18 tournament on DraftKings, and I saw the name of someone I know, and so I looked at his lineup, and it was a Yankees White Sox stack with Fetty and Cole, and I was just like, what the hell? Like, I thought this guy was good. Like, why is he building such popular lineups? But then I realized who was actually in the lineup, and he had taken the Cesar Hernandez, Gavin Sheets, Leury Garcia part of the White Sox, and just was like, oh, I'll get to this really good offense, but I'll use the 3% owned players from it. I think that's certainly a good approach that you can take with teams like the White Sox, because they still have power here. Gavin Sheets has power. Leury Garcia's got a little bit of pop and some speed. Hernandez is cheap. Not the worst hitter either. Even Grandal at 5,100 is not getting that much ownership, and he's one of the best catcher options, only playing about 9%. So the guys that are getting the ownership, Jimenez, Robert, Abreu, Anderson, they all look really, really good, and I certainly want to roster them. But this is definitely one of those teams where the bottom of the order gives you some salary savings. You're getting an ownership discount, and they're still part of a team likely to score a lot of runs. So there's multiple ways you can attack the White Sox here.
Yeah, and then on the other side is going to be Dallas Keuchel on the mound for the White Sox, and Keuchel really could not have been pitching any worse over the last month or so. He's been absolutely miserable. But he's going up against an Angels offense that kind of, I won't say equally sucked, because it's hard to be as bad as Keuchel has been, but the Angels offense hasn't been particularly good. Even Shohei Ohtani struggled quite a bit over the last course of the month and a half or whatever. I don't know that we need the salary savings for the Angels in this spot. I don't know what I'm going to be doing with the salary when there's a lack of guys to pay up for. I'll just say this. Shohei Ohtani, despite his struggles as of late, he's 1.7% projected ownership going up against Dallas Keuchel. Ohtani's still one of the most likely players to homer on the slate. There's very few times we could say Ohtani is contrarian, but I think he makes sense as a contrarian one-off today.
Yeah, agreed. Never have an issue with that.
And then Angels as a stack, is it a team you think you're going to be getting to really much against Keuchel?
I'm kind of torn here because I think Keuchel sucks. I think the Angels suck. Keuchel's pulling some ownership right now, 12.8% on DraftKings, which I get just because he's $5,800. But at the same time, he doesn't strike anyone out. I don't really mind the Angels here. We know Ohtani's good. Jared Walsh, if he's in the lineup, is a good hitter, even though it's lefty-lefty. The Angels are really cheap too. Goslin. God, where you go in this lineup is the problem. I can't even name guys that I would actually want to round out this stack. So it's one of those, I can see getting to them and just saying, okay, Keuchel's getting some ownership. The Angels are cheap. Hopefully they somehow score runs. I just don't know exactly how to do it.
What's the most random thing about the Angels? Why is Jack Mayfield projected for the most ownership on the team right now? It's all relative because none of these guys are popular. But Jack Mayfield's projected for 3.5% ownership. He's the most popular hitter in the lineup, and he's projected about 9th today. So nobody's really rostering anybody here, but it just is kind of funny. When do we see a team that's projected to have their 9 hitter with the most ownership on the team? But I think the other thing too with the Angels, not only is it a bad offense where we just look at some of these names, and another thing about the order, it's almost irrelevant. Like, is Phil Gosselin batting third really any better of a hitter than Jack Mayfield, who's hitting ninth? Right. No, not really. All these guys are bad other than Ohtani and Walsh kind of from top to bottom. But the other thing too that I think is kind of relevant here is, all right, so if you're stacking the Angels, just what are you doing with the leftover salary? Just paying up for two pitchers and then you just use, I guess, whatever three plugs on the slate you want. I still don't even know if that's the most appealing lineup build today.
Yeah, exactly. So I think like the strongest argument in favor of the Angels would be Keuchel's ownership. But even there, like, even if you think he's over-owned, he's still getting like 12% ownership. So it's not like you're getting, a third of the field, like losing it if the Angels do well. So there's enough good offensive spots here. I don't think I get to the Angels. I can at least see the case for it, but I don't think I end up getting to it.
Yeah, that's and also Dallas Keuchel, who early in the year I was really not stacking against Keuchel at all because high ground ball pitcher. There's kind of what I perceived at least as a lack of upside against him. Really has not been the case over the last month because he gives up a million runs every time he pitches. But real case of a stoppable force against a movable object here. Keuchel gets nobody out. The Angels generally don't hit anybody, so I don't really know what to expect. I'm kind of hoping that it's just whatever. Keuchel gives up like 4 runs. He doesn't score fantasy points. The Angels don't do enough to be relevant on the slate. That's kind of what I think is the most likely outcome. But moving on anyway, I wish we could just get rid of Joe Musgrove's slates, especially in this kind of spot where he's going to be going up against the San Francisco Giants, because Joe Musgrove, he always has a fairly significant upside as a pitcher, but at the same time too, there's pretty substantial downside. He's not projected for that much ownership today. We've got him at 12.9%. I think that's a number that we could get overweight to and not really have too much issue. I feel the same way about the Giants on the other side, only 0.6% projected ownership. I think there's reason to think both sides have upside and the field isn't really playing either of them.
Yeah, I agree. It's just a situation where it's a really, really difficult spot, I think. Musgrove, not a lot of strikeout upside here going up against the Giants, a good offense overall. It is a good pitcher's park, though. It is supposed to be like 55, 60 degrees, so good pitching weather. Musgrove, I think, is pretty similar to me, similar to Manaea, where I don't really like Musgrove. I would rather just have Ynoa or McGill or Urias, but there's going to be some lineups where I just don't want those guys because of how popular they are and how popular the hitters in my lineup are. In those lineups, using some Musgrove, I think makes sense. 12.5% projected ownership right now, or about 13%, is, I think, more or less where he should be coming in. If it was, much higher than that, I would think it was too high. So not really a strong take one way or the other on Musgrove. I think he's a good pitcher overall. I think the pitching conditions are good. Overall this season, 3.52 xFIP, 27.8% strikeout percentage, but it's also a really, really tough matchup. And there are similarly priced pitchers that are in better spots.
Yeah, and always one of my favorite things whenever it's a Joe Musgrove slate is just reading off his game log, which if you guys open up Fantasy Crunch and you look at his game log, it's color-coded. Green starts good, red starts bad, and he looks like a Christmas tree. It's nothing but green and red kind of alternating. So his last handful of starts, 17 fantasy points, 28, 0. And by the way, that 0 is against the Angels. 26, 15, 44, 15. All over the place. There's significant upside. There's significant downside in Musgrove. And I think that is something to take advantage of in tournaments. But on the other side, with the San Francisco Giants, there is not a single hitter projected for more than 1% ownership. Well, splitting hairs, Tommy La Stella, 1.1% ownership. Every single other player, sub 1%. I think this is a team that certainly warrants more than less than 1% ownership as a stack. We just consider all the variance in Musgrove, and is a guy who less than a month ago got torched by the Diamondbacks.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. The Giants are just a good enough offense where if they're going to be 1% owned, I don't mind getting more of them. I will say I like the A's more at 1% ownership. I like the Braves more at 2.5% ownership. But I do think the Giants fit in there where, it's not particularly likely they have success here given the park and the matchup, but they do still have a 4.5 implied run total. That's, pretty healthy here. We know Musgrove, when he's not on, things get ugly really quickly. And the Giants have good hitters top to bottom in this lineup. So as long as the ownership isn't there, I do like the Giants.
All right, just one game left here to talk about. But first, guys, today's show is sponsored by Jock Market. If you guys are unfamiliar with Jock Market, it's a different way to play daily fantasy sports. There's no kind of salary, no lineup construction. Instead, it's basically like a stock market, but for fantasy sports. To bid on players before the slate starts in an IPO period. Then after the games start, you could buy and sell the players like it's a stock market. Really fun, different way to play daily fantasy sports. If you guys want to get involved, head on over to your app store, download the app, make your first deposit using the promo code Awesemo. That gets you up to a $50 bonus on your first deposit. That is using the promo code Awesemo. So like I said, just one game left on the slate to talk about, although I forgot we didn't talk about the Padres side, but Dominic Leone. So basically going to be a bullpen game here for the San Francisco Giants. And to me, looking at a bullpen game, I don't have anything I like to really roster from the Giants, but that's going to keep me off the Padres as well.
Yeah, the Padres right now kind of just looking like the ownership is where it should be. Obviously, if you get to some Tatis or Machado or whatever, like that's fine. They're really, really good hitters, but not favorable pitching or not favorable hitting conditions. Bullpen games typically just not that appealing to roster anyway. Just not really sold on the Padres here compared to a lot of the other offenses that we can get to.
Yeah, and I kind of forgot. And by the way, thanks to Steve Leibowitz for bringing it up in the YouTube chat. But yeah, it was just a thing where in my head I was kind of writing it off, but then I forgot to say it out loud. I was just looking. I was like, "Whoa, I'm not interested in here." So we're just done with talking about it. But yeah, bullpen games, and the Giants also have a fairly decent bullpen, so something that is not all that appealing to me. The other thing also, as good as the Padres offense is, they have been absolutely miserable the second half of the season. They actually, let me sort this by WRC plus. They might even be last in the league in WRC plus in the second half of the season, which is crazy to think about. But a team that they seemed a lock to be in the playoffs at one point, and actually had, when Tatis first got hurt, one of my friends had texted me and said we should bet the Padres to miss the playoffs. They were like 12-1 to miss at that point in time. And I went over to FanGraphs, and FanGraphs had them with a 97% chance to make the playoffs at that point in time. I was like, I'm not betting against a team that's a 97% projected chance to make the playoffs. And they have basically stopped winning games ever since then. And now they have like a 22% chance or something like that to make the playoffs. But the big issue has been that offense who, yes, since the All-Star break, 90 WRC plus for San Diego Padres. They've been in some kind of funk, and it's hard to say what to attribute that to, but just kind of as an overarching kind of strategy type thing, or how you view an offense, do you view the Padres as a lesser offense now than maybe you did earlier in the year?
No. Didn't even know any of the things you just said until you just said them. Just, not something I pay attention to. It's kind of like with the, we were saying with the Astros, even if they had been struggling in the second half, you just look at who's in that lineup and how good the hitters are. And it's similar with the Padres. Like when you have a lineup that has Grisham and Tatis and Machado, granted, the Padres lineup isn't as deep as the Astros. Like Hosmer has been legitimately bad. Nola is a decent hitter for a catcher, but he's not, the best hitter overall. Like I think that the Padres could be like an average-ish offense going forward. I don't anticipate them being a bad offense, though.
Yeah, so that's kind of how I view it. Also, though, it is definitely concerning that for this long of a period of time, they only have a 90 WRC plus. We're looking at this now, over a sample size of about 2,000 plate appearances. So something going on there. I think a lot of it also could be attributed to just bad health. I don't know that Tatis has really ever gone back to be totally 100% healthy. I actually think that Bryce Harper should probably be favored to win MVP right now instead of Tatis. But that aside, Padres offense hasn't been great that lately, but not the real reason I don't like them today. It's because it's a bullpen game. That's always a little bit limiting of the upside. The final game here to talk about is the Los Angeles Dodgers at home against the Arizona Diamondbacks. And starting by talking about Julio Urias, if you're paying up for a pitcher today in cash games, Julio Urias is the first guy I would look to. Yeah,
agreed. Lowest implied run total on the slate for Arizona at 2.8. Urias is a good pitcher, comes in with a 26.7% strikeout percentage, 3.67 xFIP. He's good. Went 7 innings last game, 94 pitches through 96 pitches to start before that in 5 2/3. But as we had talked about at the time, they were trying to get him through the 6th. He just put guys on base. They took him out. No real reason to think he's on a pitch count like Sean V did last time. And I think Urias looks good here.
Yeah, and I don't really see another way around him, at least in cash games, just because he's so much safer than the other guys in the high end. When we're comparing him to Tyler McGill against St. Louis, St. Louis has a decent offense. Is still really quality starting pitcher, but maybe a little bit more variance. I guess something that's kind of interesting. Julio Suarez, I'd be good with paying up for, but as an SP2, God damn it, I meant to say I was going to say Ranger Suarez as the SP2. Would you rather go to Ranger Suarez as an SP2 or Huascar if we're considering Urias the safest pay up option?
I mean, I guess I would rather go to Inoa, but I think that the savings on Suarez, like there's still bats I want to pay for on the slate. You're going to want the Yankees. You're going to want, exposure to the White Sox. So I think I'd probably end up with Suarez as the SP2. I think the bigger question really in terms of salary is, do you end up getting to Urias or getting to the McGill Inoa price range as your SP1, because that will really depend on exactly what lineups look like and where value opens up.
Yeah, that's a reasonable point too. And to me, I still think it'd be Urias. I just like the safety that he offers that I don't think we're really getting out of other pitchers on this slate. The matchup against the Diamondbacks is a really strong one. Urias is also at home, and I almost don't want to talk about it anymore because I'm going to call him Julio Suarez again, just because I'm looking at our top pitchers still. And I don't know why I keep doing this, but they're next to each other. So Julio Urias as the pitcher with the number one top overall odds in our top pitchers duel. Ranger Suarez is second. And for whatever reason, I don't know if I've temporarily it created some sort of dyslexia where every time I look at it, it just reads as Julio Suarez to me and like Ranger Urias. But that aside, I think that Urias is still the guy who I'm prioritizing in cash games on both FanDuel and DraftKings.
Yeah, I think it'll be pretty easy too. Like I'm kind of just playing around on DraftKings right now to see what it would look like. And if you plug in Urias and Suarez, you get about $4,000 per position. And then just sort of quickly thinking about some of the pricing that we had, Luke Voit at 3,600. So he's below that. Yohan Moncada, 3,700, DJ LeMahieu, 4K. Like you're going to be able to get pretty, cheap enough guys from the Yankees and the White Sox that I think going Urias plus Suarez or something is going to open up plenty for you.
Yeah, and once again, really like the safety that we're getting here with Urias. Other side of the game, Merrill Kelly. No reason to consider him against the Dodgers. And the Dodgers offense, always worth getting to some extent, but the ownership's there. It's just kind of a neutral spot to me. So the game, at least to close out the last spot we talked about, I don't think it's of a ton of interest overall.
Agreed. I am interested in the Dodgers, obviously, because I think it's an okay spot against Kelly. He's not a bad pitcher. He's not a really good pitcher either. Kind of just an average guy, I think. Comes in with about a 20% strikeout percentage for the season, 4.14 xFIP, 1.14 home runs per nine. Dodgers clearly have tons and tons of power in their lineup. They are getting some ownership, though, like you said. So I like them, but I think that in terms of it's kind of similar to yesterday, I think, where I like the Dodgers, but in terms of teams that are likely to succeed, you have teams like the Yankees, the Astros, the White Sox ahead of them. And then in terms of teams that have really high ceilings but are low owned, you have the Braves, you have the A's, you have the Giants. So the Dodgers kind of just get pushed out for me, at least the way things look right now. And then one other point to make, going back to the cash lineup thing, Urias is going to be very easy to get in cash. I just quickly threw one together, and it's a 4-man Yankee stack, 3-man White Sox stack with Travis d'Arnaud. So very, very easy to build with Urias and cash.
Yeah, and then looking at some of the ownership here for the Dodgers, there's a lot of it going to Trey Turner at 12%. Cody Bellinger, he has really sucked this year, a 1.6% projected ownership for him at an expensive price tag. That seems a little bit much. I think the cost here is just a little bit prohibitive with the Dodgers. There aren't that many cheap pitchers I like. So just kind of looking at it at first glance, I don't know what pitchers I'd really be getting to if I played a whole bunch of Dodgers stacks, just because of how expensive these guys are. Justin Turner, 5,300, Max Muncy, Mookie Betts, Trey Turner, all of them are expensive. And from the pitching options, I don't know that I want to play just Dodger stacks with a bunch of Ranger Suarez, and then I don't even know who the other cheap pitcher would be.
Yeah, I was just if you take Muncy, Turner, Seager, Betts, it leaves you 46.60 per position. So you assume you're plugging in Ranger Suarez, and then try with Inoa. Yeah, even if you go Inoa Suarez, you have $2,400 per position. So yeah, this is the Dodgers are one of those teams where you'd end up having to roll the dice on those, Alec Mills, John Means type guy, Dallas Keuchel. Yeah, pretty ugly.
Yeah, so just in practicality, I think the Dodgers look fine in projections. I just don't know I'm going to get there relative to the pitching options on the slate. Seems like it could be a little bit of a difficulty to get to. But anyway, that is going to do it for us today, guys. A lot more content coming up on the YouTube channel. Like this video and also subscribe. We've got football content coming up today, lots of baseball content. So stick around. We've got content covered for you all day, and good luck.